In our last session, we spoke about the baptism in the Holy Spirit with the supernatural seal of speaking with other tongues. I believe that in the purposes of God, the baptism in the Holy Spirit is intended to be merely a doorway. There has been discussion in the Pentecostal movement in past years as to whether it was a goal or a gateway. And there was a time when some Pentecostals took the attitude, well, I'm saved, I'm baptized in water, I'm baptized in the Holy Spirit, I speak in tongues, I've arrived. Unfortunately, that's incorrect, and people who think they've arrived have just dropped out, that's all. The baptism is not a goal, it is a gateway. It's not the termination, it's the starting point of a life lived in supernatural power. I believe that normally, in most people's experience, the baptism in the Holy Spirit is the doorway to the supernatural gifts of the Spirit and to many other forms of supernatural experience. I believe it is impossible to live the Christian life to the full on the plane of the natural. It is permeated with the supernatural. Every chapter in the book of Acts, and there are 28, contains descriptions of events that are totally supernatural. And the book of Acts is the only official record we have of what the Lord intended the church to be. So, going on from the baptism, I want to deal in this session and in the next with the supernatural gifts of the Holy Spirit. And I'll begin, I think, by just reading the list, which is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8, 9, and 10. And if you check, you'll find there are 9 gifts. For to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, to another the word of knowledge through the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healings by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another different kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. It's been common amongst Bible teachers to divide up those 9 gifts into 3 groups of 3. This is not doctrine, it's just convenience. And I'll do it briefly before we focus on the particular gifts that I want to deal with in this session. There are 3 gifts of revelation: a word of wisdom, a word of knowledge, and what's the third one? Yes, somebody said it. Discernings of spirits. Those are 3 revelatory gifts. There are 3 gifts which we can, for want of a better term, describe as gifts of power: faith, miracles, what's the third one? Healings, that's right. And that leaves us with 3 which are usually called the vocal gifts, because they operate through human vocal organs. Interestingly enough, the gifts that always cause the problems are the vocal gifts, because the tongue is the problem member in the body. What are the vocal gifts? Tongues, interpretation, and prophecy. Now, we are going to deal in this session only with those 3 vocal gifts. We've spoken already about the seal of the baptism in the Holy Spirit, speaking with another tongue or a new tongue. Now, that really is not the gift of tongues. The gift of tongues is called here and elsewhere kinds of tongues or varieties of tongues. In other words, it's more than simply speaking with another tongue. I believe every believer baptized in the Holy Spirit has the divine right and gift to communicate personally with the Lord in another tongue at any time. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14 about that, he that speaketh in another tongue speaketh not to men, but to God. For no man understandeth him. Howbeit in the Spirit he speaks mysteries. He that speaketh in another tongue edifieth himself. So there are three functions, three reasons for speaking in another tongue. Number one, you're speaking to God. That's a privilege. How many of you would agree that's a privilege? Direct communication, spirit to spirit with the living God. Number two, you're speaking mysteries, secrets, things that potty little mind of yours doesn't understand. And three, you're edifying or building yourself up. A lot of people will ask you, what's the use of speaking in tongues? Well, there are three precise answers. The use of speaking in tongues is to communicate direct with God, to speak mysteries, and to build yourself up. If there were no other reasons, those would be sufficient. But I believe that the full gift of kinds of tongues goes on beyond that. Kinds of tongues is different uses of tongues. Another kind of tongues is to speak out loud in the assembly in an unknown tongue with something that is to be followed by an interpretation. Another use of the tongues is as a sign to unbelievers. This is very rare. Most charismatics don't think about it. But it happens at times that when God's people are together or God's people are ministering, a believer will speak a language which he doesn't know, but an unbeliever present understands that language. That's a sign to unbelievers. I remember one case of a young man who is now my son-in-law, many years ago, was brought in from a street meeting in London. He was from Wales. And you probably know the Welsh people have their own language, which they're very proud of. And it was, quote, a gospel service, and I just preached my gospel message, and I was about to make my gospel appeal, and an elderly gentleman there spoke in an unknown tongue. Well, I was indignant. I thought, that's altogether out of order. He's ruined my appeal. And I don't remember what followed that, but one of my daughters had brought this young man into the meeting, and he nudged her and said, "Why is that old man telling everybody about my sins in public?" And it took 10 minutes to convince him that the man didn't know a word of Welsh, but he was speaking Welsh, you see. In Seattle, Washington, some good many years ago now, from St. Luke's Church, Episcopal Church there was a lady visiting the sick in a hospital, and she came to a man, and she spoke to him in English, and he didn't respond, he didn't understand. He was there in bed, sick. So, being one of those crazy charismatics, she just spoke to him in tongues. And he brightened up, answered her, she answered him back, and they had a little conversation. The man was greatly encouraged. She didn't know what language she'd been speaking. She learned later it was Canary Island Spanish. That was his language. A friend of ours was in Russia not so long ago, a lady, and she was sitting next to a Russian in the subway, and the man looked so sad and so downcast. She thought, I'd love to do something for him, so she just trusted the Lord, opened her mouth and started to speak to him in Russian. Now, those are exceptions. They're not normal, but they're one of the uses. And then I think there are many different forms of speaking in tongues, like, how many of you have ever had the experience of seeming really angry when you're speaking in tongues? You know? I mean, you can't believe it comes out like a torrent. Well, I believe that's when you're confronting evil forces. You don't know how to pray, you don't know what to say, but the Holy Spirit comes through them. And then there's tongues, which is just for worship. It's just simply communication with God. In other words, tongues is a very rich field. Now, we're not going to deal with that any further now, but we're going to go on to the other two vocal gifts. interpreting and prophesying. We need to begin with a definition. The gift of interpretation has no meaning apart from the gift of tongues. But if someone has spoken in an unknown tongue by the Holy Spirit, the gift of interpretation enables either that person or another person, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, not through intellectual understanding, to speak out in a known language that which was said beforehand in an unknown language. Now, it is interpretation. It's not exactly translation. That's interesting, because I don't know how many of you have spoken through an interpreter in a foreign country. I've done it many times. We discover all interpreters are different. Everyone uses certain words. Some use a lot of words. Some use fewer words. I remember we had a Canadian come out to Kenya when I was there. He was speaking through one of the best interpreters in the country. And he said a short sentence, and the interpreter took off and spoke for about 2 minutes. So the Canadian turned to his interpreter and said, "Did I say all that?" So the interpreter said, "No, but in order to make them understand what you said, I had to say all that." That's interpreting. It's communicating the sense. A brother that I know quite well from Britain, who is now in the States, told me that in the early days when they had rallies, Pentecostal rallies in the center of London, there was a situation in which somebody gave an utterance in tongues, and they waited for the interpretation. And when it came from a man who was a Cockney. How many of you know what a Cockney is? Theoretically born within the sound of the Bow Bells in London. I cannot imitate Cockney. It's outside my abilities. But the interpretation was this, and of course I don't think you Americans will understand it, but half a mo, my people, half a mo. Well, half a mo is half a moment. In other words, hold on a moment, don't be so rapid. You see, that was the interpretation. It's characteristic. It's a Cockney interpretation. So there's quite a lot of room for flexibility in this area of interpretation. However, it is communicating in a known language the sense of what was said previously in an unknown language. And then prophesying just goes one step further.